Hi, welcome to Human Health and Safety. This is Human Health and Safety. It is part 7 in the Oiled Wildlife Volunteer Hazwoper series, and I am Jenny Schlietz from Focus Wildlife. So our learning objectives for this training are to understand and recognize some of the basic safety concerns that happen working in an oiled wildlife response, to identify the ways to eliminate or mitigate threats to human health and safety, and to recognize the considerations that are related to personal protective equipment use during a spill response. So, human health and safety. One thing to be aware of just in terms of the general hazards in an oil spill is that oiled wildlife response really takes place in a situation where there are unfamiliar surroundings, both in the field and in a rehabilitation facility. There are multiple hazards. People are taking on new tasks. There are many people involved in a response and a constant level of communication and very long hours. So there are lots of hazards that can potentially happen during an oiled wildlife response. Some of those typical hazards that we see are pretty standard for the rest of our lives. Things like slips, trips, and falls, working with equipment where there may be pinch points or sharp edges that can puncture skin or cause abrasions, working in areas where the terrain itself or working on or near water may present a hazard. There can be temperature extremes, both in field operations and in a rehabilitation facility where the facility is generally kept quite warm, over 85 degrees generally in certain areas. That can cause a level of both fatigue and potentially heat stress. There are also numerous situations where we may face low light conditions that can alter our ability to see things correctly and therefore to identify those hazards. When it comes to some of the hazards directly from animals, those typically look like scratches or bites or puncture wounds, as well as the potential for zoonotic disease transmission. So those would be diseases that are transmitted between or from animals to humans. And then there's also a category of things called near misses. So those are situations that are recognized as a hazard that was prevented before it took place, but something that we can use to ensure a greater level of safety as we move forward in a response. So some of the guidelines to cope with hazards, first and foremost, using common sense and good judgment. Thinking before you act is really critical, particularly in a spill response situation where you are facing lots of new conditions and situations. It's important to take work breaks to recognize sort of what your limitations are and to take a break if you're feeling tired or dehydrated or need to eat. Also to take a break if you need to find some shelter to either get warm or to cool down, and to dress appropriately for the work that you're going to do, both in terms of your protective equipment and the regular work clothes that you wear outside of that. Most critical to that is to be aware of surroundings. There's a thing called situational awareness, and that is really fundamentally about being able to look at the larger field in which you're working, larger surroundings and where you're working, and identifying hazards. So within the world of sort of safety conversations, there is a thing called the hierarchy of controls, and those generally are ways that we can eliminate or protect ourselves against certain hazards. So the largest of those that allows us to mitigate the most hazards is a form of elimination. So it eliminates or removes the hazard from the workplace. The next most effective means is to substitute whatever work we're doing or the situation in which we're doing it with a less hazardous condition, practice, or process. Followed by engineering controls. So those are physical changes that reduce our potential exposure or that isolate us from a particular hazard. And then the last two, which are the least effective means, are administrative controls and protective equipment. So administrative controls improve the way in which work is done, and personal protective equipment protect the worker. So in a spill response, it can be quite difficult to either eliminate or substitute the hazard. A spill response in and of itself is a hazard. But we do have some means of engineering controls to reduce hazard exposure. So those can look like things like using the buddy system, or to ensure that we have staff only doing specific tasks that may present a greater danger, because staff may have more familiarity with those specific tasks. We can use administrative controls to improve the tasking that's related to that specific hazard. So that can be something like ensuring that we have appropriate protocols that we train people on for how to handle specific species, as opposed to something like PPE, which may protect us from, let's say, an animal injury, and prevent that injury from pinching the skin or opening up the skin, but it's really the protocol that would keep us safe by the handling technique. Safety meetings are a critically important piece of a safety regimen, so that they ensure that the site safety plan or the health and safety plan is followed, and that plan is specific to the conditions and where you're working. So the safety meeting that happens every morning can identify changes that need to be made to the plan. And it takes suggestions and recognitions of safety issues from the people who are doing the work up to the unified command, and provides a two-way avenue of communication so that that plan can be revised to include those safety issues, to greater ensure that we have an effective safety plan. Another means that we use typically on a spill response is a job safety analysis or a job hazard analysis. So that's a means of understanding what tasking we're about to do and to figure out what the safety issues might be with it. So there's 4 critical components to that piece. One is to know what job we're actually doing, and to then break down that job into a sequence of steps and identify the hazards to each step. And then the preventive measures that overcome those hazards, and who is responsible for putting that into place. So this is a pretty typical job safety analysis worksheet that shows those 4 components. So what's the activity? What are the hazards related to them? What are the risk control measures? And then who is responsible for implementation? Okay, a little bit about wildlife hazards. So when we talk about wildlife hazards, we are really talking about two forms, both the macro and the micro. So biological hazards on a macro scale are related to the species or animals that we might come into contact with during a wildlife response, whether they're impacted by oil or not. If we're out doing search and capture in the field and there is an adult bear with cubs there, then that is potentially a hazard, in the same way that handling an adult puffin can cause serious injury. On a micro level, we're really talking about things like viruses and bacteria, parasites like these little Giardia flagellates in the slide here, that can cause safety issues for us as people. So on a responder health and safety level, we're prone to all of these sorts of biological hazards: bacterial, parasitic, fungal, as well as viral, and that includes zoonotic diseases that may come from any of those types of pathogens. So with zoonotic disease, regardless of the agent or the means of transmission, the prevention for the majority of them are things that we should already have in our wheelhouse and things that we should already be familiar with. So for most of them, it's things like proper protocol for handling animals or handling any of the waste that's generated from animal housing, proper hygiene, washing your hands, using protective gear like gloves when you're handling animals, and then just sort of basic first aid if there is an open skin due to a wound or abrasion or something like that. Okay, heat stress. Heat stress is a major hazard and one that we certainly encounter during the course of oil wildlife response. It typically can become worse when we're wearing PPE, in part because the same materials that are protecting us and shielding our body from chemical exposure also really limit the dissipation of body heat and moisture outside of that suit. Heat stress can happen quite readily. If the ambient temperature in the environment in which you're working, either in a facility or in the field, is a high temperature, it can increase our risk of heat stress and can happen in as short a period of time as 15 minutes. So heat stress can pose as great a danger to our health and safety as can chemical exposure. Some of the symptoms of heat stress are dizziness, confusion, excessive sweating, heat rash. That's one that I typically see fairly quickly, is heat rash, headache, severe thirst, nausea, and cramps. With the forms of heat stress, heat rash can result from continuous exposure to heat or humid air. Heat cramps are typically caused by heavy sweating and an inability to control or inability to, sorry, my dog is sitting here like butting his head against me and it's very annoying. Okay. Forms of heat stress. Heat rash may result from continuous exposure to heat or humid air. And then heat cramps are frequently caused by heavy sweating with an inadequate electrolyte replacement. So fundamentally dehydration. And the symptoms can include muscle spasms, pain in hands, feet, or abdomen. Heat exhaustion is another form of heat stress, and it's caused by an increased stress on body organs, including poor blood circulation due to dehydration and cardiovascular insufficiency. So the symptoms for that, and one that's very typical of heat exhaustion as opposed to regular heat stress, is cool, pale, and moist skin. There is also heavy sweating, dizziness, nausea, and fainting, so similar as it is for heat stress. This is actually a photo from the Deepwater Horizon response. These are shoreline cleanup workers in this yellow protective gear here, and you can see that they must be quite hot wearing that kind of protective equipment when it's, clearly the weather is nice and warm and bathing attire is being worn elsewhere. Right, heat stroke is the most serious form of heat stress. So it's defined as having a core body temperature of at least 105 degrees Fahrenheit and a complete inability to thermoregulate our own body temperatures. The symptoms are very differentiated from other forms of heat stress. So red, hot, and dry skin, a complete lack or very reduced sweating, mostly because, all of the prior bodily fluids have been actually sweated out. Dizziness and a level of profound confusion. It's often seen as an inability to make decisions or to be able to form a complete sentence. And then a strong rapid pulse, and it can result in a coma. So it's critical with heat stroke that immediate action is taken to cool body temperature and that medical help is required. So it's an immediate call to 911 while we are working to cool that person's body temperature. So the first immediate actions that need to happen is to have the person lie down, use a fan or cool water, including cool compresses to lower that person's body temperature, elevate their feet, and ensure that medical help is on the way rapidly. There are some particular factors that predispose us to heat stress, and most of us have these factors, right? So it can be a lack of physical fitness, lack of acclimatization to the environment in which you're working, particularly the temperature in which you're working, age, dehydration. A secondary effect of dehydration can be diarrhea, so it's pulling more fluids from your body, so it causes greater dehydration. It's a cycle that happens. Obesity, alcohol and drug use, any sort of ongoing infection and or sunburn or chronic disease, all of those can predispose us to heat stress. So ways to avoid heat stress. Avoid overprotection. So really be aware of the job you're doing and the type of PPE that's required, and try to balance that with the level of heat that you're going to be in contact with and working in. A progressive period in which you can acclimate to the temperature can be really helpful. It's often difficult on an emergency response, but it is something that should be considered. And a 6-day period to acclimate to temperatures is recommended. Frequent fluid replacement, so something that looks like a ½ liter every ½ hour is an easy thing to remember and sort of to be used as a guideline to ensure that we maintain hydration status. And then frequent monitoring of our heart rate and temperature. And that's something that can be helped along by the buddy that you work with to just sort of check in on your heart rate and remind you to think about your temperature. Work and rest periods are also really critical within this to avoid heat stress. In the Deepwater Horizon response, they actually worked in a system where they reduced the work to rest ratio by 1/3. So people worked for 20 minutes and then went into a shelter for 40 minutes to hydrate and to get some rest. And that was ensured, particularly if the heart rate exceeded 110 beats per minute, or if the body temperature exceeded 99.6 Fahrenheit. So these are things that we really need to consider when we look at what the work ratio is during a response. Some key elements are that most people who become unconscious due to heat stroke do not survive. So prevention is really key. It's much more effective than mitigating the danger afterwards. Okay, on the opposite extreme is cold exposure. So it's most dangerous at a low temperature with a low wind chill factor. And that's often because without wind, people don't recognize how cold the temperature actually is and don't prepare for it adequately. So cold injury is a real danger and it can really impair our ability to work. Your muscles do not work as well when they're cold. And so that can predispose you to other risks as well. Frostbite is a type of cold injury. So it happens when the skin or tissues become frozen. Extremities are commonly affected. So nose, ears, fingers, and toes, very, very common, as well as cheeks. And the symptoms are hard, pale, cold skin that's been exposed to cold air for a long time. So hypothermia occurs when more heat is lost from the body than the body can generate back. And it's caused by an extended exposure to cold and is defined as a core body temperature dropping below 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's really critical that we understand how to adequately protect from that. So appropriate PPE is one means to do that. So ensuring that we have appropriate full clothing in really cold responses and in the conditions in which we're going to work, that we have an available shelter where we might be able to warm up and take a break from being outside, staying dry when and if possible, and then again, looking at our work and rest periods. And monitoring our own health and the health of the person we're working with. Okay, noise exposure is another thing that we see frequently on spill responses. It can really, really interfere with communication on a work site, both indoors and outside working in the field. And that interference with communication can itself cause other problems and make us unaware of certain types of dangers that might be in the area that we're working in. It can startle or distract workers, as well as certainly cause things like pain or hearing loss. So typically we would wear hearing protection when we're working in the field anywhere around loud noises. So that includes both earplugs that are actually in your ear and then earmuffs that are often included on a hard hat and just fold down to cover your ears securely. It can mean that it's more difficult to hear, but it does protect your hearing. This is just a graph of the decibel scale. So typical sort of conversation is at around 65 decibels. Things like, riveters or airboats are somewhere around 120 decibels. So these are getting into the areas where it can really cause damage to our hearing. Okay, vehicle safety. These are some pretty common sense things about vehicle safety that we all should know and do every day, but they're things that we tend to forget when we're working very long hours during a spill response and we're very tired. And we're either going to or from the job site or to or from the field or transporting animals. And it's critical that we remember these steps to ensure that we can act safely. So always wear your seatbelt. Again, you're in unfamiliar settings and unfamiliar landscapes. So really important to wear your seatbelt, familiarize yourself with the controls, adjust your mirrors in your seat. Don't drive with your work boots. The tread on work boots often is not very good for driving and can cause a danger, but also your work boots may have come into contact with oil, and so that can provide a slippery base on your work boot that may prevent you from shifting appropriately or braking appropriately. Don't drive when drowsy or tired or when you're eating, and really limit distractions, the first of which is a cell phone. There's lots of recommendations on spill sites to do things like put your cell phone in the trunk of a car so that you cannot access it while you're driving. Important to consider some of the types of really heavy equipment that you could be working around in the field. These are pictures from spill sites. Visibility around heavy equipment is really limited, and it's really important to assume that you cannot be seen. So when you're working in a field where there is heavy equipment, it's really important to stay alert at all times. Hand signals can be a really effective means of ensuring that you are seen. Eye contact is something that you can't really manage when you're talking about somebody sitting in the top of a very large truck that has 13-foot tall tires and the driver is sitting some 10 feet above that. So you want to make sure that you're using hand signals and that you're within the line of the sight of the person operating that heavy equipment. Always wear a bright safety vest, so something that is high visibility, as well as a hard hat. And make sure that you're only approaching or moving through that traffic once you're given the go-ahead by the person operating heavy equipment. This is not a staged photo. This is a real photo from a site on which I did a response. And you can see this is a quite large pickup truck, absolutely crushed because the driver was not aware that they were outside of the line of sight of this really heavy vehicle. So accidents can and do happen, and it's really, really important that we're aware of those types of situations. So the buddy system is one of the ways that can increase our awareness. So a buddy system is just a two-person team that works together on whatever task they're provided or given. The buddy that you're working with should be there to assist you, and you should be there to assist them. So you should be observing your partner for signs of heat exposure or heat stress, for any sort of chemical penetration into their protective equipment. If they're doing something that you perceive as unsafe, it's a good thing to raise that to them and just ask them about it to ensure that you can keep them safe and they can keep you safe. So you want to check the integrity of your partner's PPE. And then if there's an emergency, that buddy also acts as the person who can notify the command post that you need help. So it's really critical that we work within a two-person system. All right, on to personal protective equipment. There was an earlier presentation by Don Noviello that talked about some of these, but I'm going to go over them just as a reminder about the way in which personal protective equipment is used during a world wildlife response. So there's a few considerations when we look at PPE, and some of those have to do with the materials. So we want to make sure that any material that is used for our protective equipment is resistant to permeation, so that the chemical can't move on a molecular level through that material and then onto our skin. We want to ensure that it doesn't degrade quickly. So there will certainly be changes in how impermeable that fabric is, but it shouldn't be an immediate degradation of that ability to resist chemicals when it's worn. We should be looking at where chemicals can move through things like stitch seams or zippers or other imperfections in our PPE. And we also need to balance the chemical protection with its potential to increase heat stress. Okay, so PPE also needs to be durable. It needs to be able to withstand the physical stress of the type of work that you're engaged in, but it needs to be flexible enough to not interfere with our ability to actually perform work. So some materials that we use, whether it's to protect ourselves from oil or to protect ourselves from wildlife, can reduce our tactile sensations, and we have to be aware of that when we're looking at PPE. We also need to make sure that it can maintain its integrity and flexibility under both hot and cold extremes. Some PPE becomes brittle under cold environments, and so we really want to be aware of that and make sure that that doesn't cause a crack or something that can allow chemicals to permeate through the PPE. Some considerations around PPE: we need to be sure that it can be decontaminated easily, or if it cannot be decontaminated, that it is meant to be disposed of appropriately. It needs to be compatible with our other protective equipment. And it needs to be able to be durable through however long the particular task is that we're working on. It needs to be able to be durable through that entire process. We also do want to look at some cost elements. It may be that some of the reusable PPE that we have is a higher price, but is reusable throughout a much longer period, as opposed to some of the disposable PPE that is available. In other situations, it may be that disposable is a requirement based on the type of chemicals that we're working with or the type of situation that we're in. It's important to know that no single protective material is totally impermeable forever, and no single protective material protects against all chemicals. With certain chemicals, it may actually not be protective for more than 1 hour after initial contact. Those are unlikely to be the chemicals that we would be working with in an oiled wildlife response, but it is something to be aware of. And again, we should always remember that PPE is the last line of defense that we have against chemical contaminants or against injury from wildlife, for that matter. And so we need to ensure that we're really using it correctly. As mentioned in the earlier presentation, there are a number of different levels of protective gear that are used in emergency response, and typically we use something that is called level D. So that includes Tyvek coveralls, gloves, a hard hat, eye protection, boots, whatever your basic work PPE is that you would be wearing under the Tyvek garment, and then liquid resistant sleeves. In certain situations, we actually wear something that's a modified level D PPE. So this is again a photograph from the Deepwater Horizon response, where this person who's a longtime responder is wearing appropriate boots and appropriate sun gear up top, and then has a Tyvek coverall that's just tied around his waist because there's no oil right where he is, so he's not really in any danger, but he's doing reconnaissance for oiled wildlife. So if he were about to capture an oiled animal, he would first make sure that he puts the top of that Tyvek suit on to protect himself entirely from oil contamination. Okay, a few tips for using PPE. Never use damaged PPE. PPE should be properly cleaned and inspected before every use. It should be selected for the hazard, and it should fit correctly. Tyvek coveralls are well known for their odd sizing. So for people who are a medium or a large, you should expect to wear an extra large to an XXL in Tyvek coveralls. It's just something to be aware of, because otherwise what happens is while you're wearing it, if you move or choose a different stance, it will often tear. And so you want to make sure that you're not in a situation where you're exposed just doing your job because your coveralls don't fit correctly. You should be trained in using PPE before you're actually putting it on and going into a hazard area, and only using PPE as a last resort to control hazards. Again, your main controls over hazards are going to be either eliminating or exchanging that hazard, or an administrative control, procedural controls. So for field-related equipment, the type of PPE that we generally wear is hearing protection, protective clothing like Tyvek, We'll always have a personal flotation device, a PFD, if we're working on the water or near the water. Safety glasses, hard hats, and steel-toed boots. We may be asked to have half-faced respirators. It's not common, but there are times where, as a matter of preparedness, we may be fitted with half-mask respirators in order to leave an area safely, but not to just conduct general field work in it. On a facility-related note, we wear similar types of protective equipment, particularly eye protection, non-skid shoes and boots, and then protective clothing like gloves, long sleeves, long pants, Tyvek coveralls or oil-resistant clothing. These are hurricane slickers that we wear, so they're both oil resistant and or fire retardant. The orange are often fire retardant, so we would wear these when we're working with oiled wildlife, often with a Tyvek suit underneath them, or in the washroom where we might wear these alone. So just a quick recap of the presentation. Oiled wildlife response presents unfamiliar situations, new tasks, and people all working long hours in an emergency, and it can be full of hazards. The buddy system is an effective means to keep us safe and should be used. Slips, trips, fatigue, and hypothermia are common hazards on a spill site. Heat stroke and hypothermia are critical conditions that need to be dealt with rapidly. PPE is the last line of defense. And it's important to use common sense and good judgment to mitigate our hazards. It's really the best means to provide for our safety is to think before acting, and then always consider whether an action is safe. Thank you.